we believe, this year, also on ignorance. There is a book on atheism in the wings. He is involved in many projects. He received a very beautiful grant from the ERC, the European Research Council, on extremist beliefs. And he is also fully participating in this project on the epistemic responsibilities of the university. I could go on for many more minutes, but I won't do that in the interest of not talking about Rick, but hearing him talk. So thank you very much, Rick, for being with us.
Well, thank you, René, for that kind and flattering introduction. Today, I'm going to talk about, unsurprisingly, about progress in theology, but I'm going to defend a rather specific view about it, namely that there is what you could call manifold progress in theology. And not only that, also that we should be bold about this, right? So I call it philosophical reflections, partly philosophical, partly theological, that call for boldness. All right, and I put this image here of Celtic crossroads, so the roads for progress and then Celtic for reference, by way of reference to theology, really. All right, what is the nature of progress? So what are we talking about in the first place? First, of course, etymologically, the word derives from the Latin progredi, which means to move forward, to progress. And that, of course, is always something that has to do with a particular goal, at least in the case of intentional progress. To progress means to move towards a goal. And that is a movement that can occur on a certain scale, right? So I can progress more than I did yesterday, or someone else can progress more than I did, or one discipline can progress more within a certain time period than another, and so on. It's a matter of scale. Not only that, it also comes with certain norms. It is norm-infused, as René pointed out earlier today. For instance, the Nazis moved on a certain scale when it came to their horrific aim of destroying Jews in Europe, annihilating them, but we wouldn't call that progress, right? So, of course we wouldn't, because the aims were horrific. So we talk about progress when the aims or when the goals are good, usually intrinsically good. And the final consideration about the nature of progress is that it is a temporal phenomenon. It occurs in time, in the course of time. Right. Basically, that's a bit about the metaphysics of progress. Actually, I thought there are many interesting philosophical and theological questions to be asked about the nature of progress. Maybe that's a topic for another time. So these are just what I consider to be the basics. All right. Let's see. Progress challenged. Let's see. This is not going well. Progress challenged. There are various challenges that have been leveled in the literature against the very idea of progress in theology. And one main reason some have doubted the very notion of progress in theology, of course, has to do with knowledge. And here is Alex Rosenberg, who was already mentioned by René earlier today. Quote, "When it comes to real understanding, the humanities are nothing we have to take seriously except as symptoms. But they are everything we need to take seriously when it comes to entertainment, enjoyment, and psychological satisfaction. Just don't treat them as knowledge or wisdom." That's the advice of Alex Rosenberg, the philosopher of science. Now, of course, what is going on here is a scientistic way of thinking, as he lays it out in An Atheist's Guide to Reality. And scientism is, of course, a rather controversial thesis that is up for debate. But the core claim here is, I think, clear. The humanities, and also theology, potentially one of the humanities, doesn't deliver any knowledge. Actually, in this quote, he doesn't say why one should think that. But at least that's the idea. All right, this is something we will have to tackle in order to defend the idea that there can be progress in theology. But there are further considerations. Another consideration often found is that there is no consensus or no convergence towards consensus in theology. You could even defend that the opposite holds. So we find an increasingly wider variety of views, and sometimes conflicting views. People who have pointed this out in particular are, of course, the four horsemen of atheism, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, but numerous others have pointed this out as well. And in fact, some theologians and some philosophers worry about this. A third consideration can be found in the work of, among others, Herman Philips, the Dutch philosopher. Here's a quote. He says, in criticizing Richard Swinburne's view, who provides various arguments in favor of the existence of God, he says, in short, Swinburne attempts both to circumvent the scylla of option E, namely that theism lacks credibility in our age of science, and here the italics are mine, because the methods which theologians use in investigating its truth cannot be validated. And he says, and the Charybdis of option F, that whatever natural theologians adduce specific evidence in order to confirm theism within the framework of a cumulative case, this very evidence might be explained better by a rival secular explanation. So here I'm not concerned with the rival secular explanation, but with this bold assertion that the methods which theologians use in investigating its truth or its alleged truth cannot be validated. What is the idea here? Well, his point seems to be that the same method should yield consistent and informative results. And he suggests that's not the case for theology. He also suggests that various methods should lead to the same result. And he says that the method should be theoretically understood. So different, distinct claims, really. And I find a lot of these claims somewhat problematic. So when it comes to the second one, for instance, so different methods should lead to the same result. That seems to be the notion of triangulation. And of course, triangulation, so the different methods leading to the same result, is a highly valuable thing, epistemically speaking, but it's widely thought that it's not necessary to come to knowledge and understanding in academic disciplines. For instance, we can study Augustine or Aquinas, so study their texts, even if we have no other means to get access to their ideas than just reading and analyzing their texts. Right? How would it follow that we cannot have knowledge of their ideas? What if there is no progress in theology? Gijsbert addressed this question earlier on today and suggested that that is not necessarily a problem. And I agree with him on that point, even though I will continue to offer a slightly different reason for it. So what I will suggest here is something along the lines of what the philosopher Ian Kidd has suggested. So you might think that each generation in the course of time will ask different questions, and each time period will give rise to different questions. And it is among the tasks of theology to answer those questions. So our time, of course, calls for answers to questions about migration, for instance, about globalization, about the climate crisis, about sexuality and gender. These are big questions in our time. And those are questions that were not important or entirely absent in earlier times. So the kinds of questions change over time, and some lose their relevance. And you might think that theology is in the business of answering those questions, but since the earlier ones drop at some point or lose their relevance, you can't really speak of progress. But of course, it is still relevant. It can provide knowledge and understanding in answering those questions. So even if there is no progress on any solid definition of progress, I would say, so what? Shrug your shoulders and move on, I would say. All right. What follows? Should we be optimists about progress? I am slightly skeptical about this idea of being an optimist about progress. So this is a term that is used by Daniel Stoljar in his writing about progress in philosophy. And the reason is that if you're optimistic about something, you take it that there is a significant chance that it will occur, but also a significant chance that it might not occur. And I do not take myself to be in that position, because I take myself to be in a much stronger position. I today am going to suggest that I know that there has been and is, and in all likelihood will be, progress in theology. And in fact, I'm even willing to bite the bigger bullet of saying that what I'm going to argue is based on public evidence, so that each and every one of you is in the same epistemic position. We should not be optimists, we should be knowers. All right, that's the idea, to be bold. Dimensions of progress. Of course, there are different dimensions of progress. And it is clear that the focus is in most cases on the epistemic dimension of progress. Well, the epistemic dimension of progress, of course, has to do with knowledge and understanding, with true belief, with rational belief, justified belief, wisdom maybe. And of course, there are distinctions among each of these different epistemic goals. And in my earlier writing on this topic, I kind of myopically focused on these epistemic goals, which I slightly regret now, because I think there are more goals, and potentially goals to academic scholarship, theology included. There can be moral goals. So what I have in mind here is the well-being of human beings, the well-being of animals, the flourishing of society, the well-being of planet Earth, social justice, right? These are moral goals or moral considerations. And I'm going to suggest that theology can potentially make progress with regard to such moral goals. There are also prudential goals. They have to do with what is wise, what is practical, what is helpful, what is useful in society, for instance. And finally, potentially there is also such a thing as religious progress. So here one can think of, for instance, the glorification of God. Theology is by many taken to be such that one of the main purposes is the glorification of God, or serving the church, or increasing people's faith. Right? These are potentially also among the goals of theology. All right, so let's look a little bit more at these three other goals. Now, nobody questions that academic disciplines have epistemic goals, like knowledge and understanding. Yet I think it is undeniable that moral goals also play a role in academic scholarship, theology included. So straight away, one can think, for instance, of the entire field blossoming and flourishing these days of research integrity. That has to do with epistemic norms, but also, which is quite obvious, I think, with moral norms, such as research should not cause any environmental pollution, it should not do harm to animals, it should take the rights of aboriginals or natives seriously, it should acknowledge authorship and not include those who are not authors, for moral considerations as well. There shouldn't be any studies on the intelligence of races, no matter what the epistemic situation is. For moral reasons, we shouldn't do so. And one way to think of this is that these moral goals provide the confines, all the ones I just mentioned, are confines within which we can carry out academic scholarship, and thus within those confines aim at the epistemic goals like knowledge and understanding. Yet, I think the issue is even slightly more complex. I think moral goals are not just important to setting the confines, but also to setting the agenda, the topics that deserve study. So here we can think of race studies, for instance, carried out in this country, the Netherlands, by Gloria Wekker. Liberation studies, gender studies, doing justice to minorities, for instance, when it comes to apartheid. Green theology, peace and trauma studies, in order to prevent war or help people deal with suffering. You can think of interfaith theology, right? So I think the idea here is that certain themes are just morally really important, more important than other ones. So that morally speaking, we ought to pay attention to those topics. So moral considerations are agenda setting. I think that's the idea, right? So they can determine which objects deserve study. Now, of course, once the goal is set, right, so the confines are set and the goal is set, of course, then the aim is to reach these epistemic goals, so to acquire knowledge and understanding about the thing in question. So an example here would be, for instance, this recently funded project at the Protestant Theological University in this country on the relation between slavery and the role of the church in the, I think, 17th and 18th centuries. So moral considerations set the confine, determine the agenda, but then once we're there, of course, we seek knowledge and understanding, even if it's going to be painful or controversial, or it might cause a certain social dynamic that we don't like. That doesn't really matter. Once we're in there, we seek knowledge and understanding, so we seek these epistemic goals. All right. It follows, though, from what I've argued so far, that in addition to epistemic goals, it is entirely legitimate to think of the moral and prudential goals that theology can pursue, and to think of progress in theology partly along these moral and prudential goals. So do they rightly determine certain boundaries, and have they rightly chosen certain topics as relevant topics for research? Right, that brings me to the final one, the fourth one, the religious or spiritual, or however you call it, dimension of progress. So as I said, here we can think of the glorification of God, for instance, or increasing people's faith and so on, right? How does this work? Well, I think an example in case would be, for instance, what Blaise Pascal famously said about the professors at the University of the Sorbonne in Paris. So here I think his idea was what these people are doing is just idle metaphysical speculation because it's insufficiently tied to what people's actual faith is. Right? So here he doesn't have primarily epistemic considerations in mind, but religious or spiritual ones. And of course, in secular circles, people might laugh at this, or I don't know, however they want to deal with that. But I think that shouldn't make religious scholars or theologians in particular shy away from pursuing these goals, right? And again, I think this is perfectly compatible with pursuing epistemic goals. And I think this is particularly true in Christianity, where the basic idea is that God is a God of truth, right? God is not a God of falsehood or lies or irrationality or anything like that. So once these religious considerations determine certain confines or pick a certain agenda or develop a certain style, we can pursue these epistemic goals. And by the way, the Blaise Pascal comment was not meant to argue against any sort of metaphysics generally, just the sort of idle metaphysical speculation that was found with the professors of the Sorbonne at the time. Nothing remotely related to what's currently going on in metaphysics, of course. René is professor in epistemology and metaphysics, so just to be clear about that. All right. And what I have in mind by the style, finally, is something like the right sort of humility, for instance. Being a humble, or adopting a humble approach, or being a humble theologian even, maybe. All right, let's zoom in on these epistemic goals before we move to the moral and prudential and rich one in some more detail. What are these epistemic goals? Well, of course, the name that comes to mind here is the famous American psychologist William James, who in The Will to Believe and Other Essays, and also in other essays, argued that the goal of cognition is really twofold. On the one hand, we ought to seek believing the truth, and on the other hand, we ought to seek not believing any falsehoods. So straight away, we have two distinct epistemic goals. And that, of course, raises the question how those two relate to one another and how one should balance them. But at least we have these two. But of course, there are further ones, like rational belief, roughly believing in accordance with one's evidence, knowledge, justified true belief plus some sort of anti-luck condition probably, but potentially also knowledge by acquaintance, which many take to be different or distinct from propositional knowledge, and know-how or practical or procedural knowledge. Potentially, academic scholarship can also aim at that. So, for instance, I was reminded here of the recent picture of the first picture in history of a black hole. That was not merely a case of propositional knowledge. It went beyond that. It was an attempt to get to some extent acquainted with a black hole. But there's more than knowledge. There's also understanding. So Stephen Grimm has written extensively on understanding and how it differs from mere knowledge. It has to do with seeing certain patterns or exploring the modal space, so seeing what is possible with regard to a topic and what not. And of course, there's wisdom. And that may well have certain epistemic dimensions, but potentially also moral dimensions. All right, so do we find epistemic progress in theology? I'm going to suggest that we find it all over the place, and partly in virtue of things that contribute to each of these. Right? So you can reach them directly and sometimes indirectly. First, if we look at the history of theology, you find ever more views on some issues. And sometimes they are mutually exclusive, but very often they are perfectly compatible. They just focus on different aspects or different sides of the issue. So here you can think, for instance, of personalized and heavily context-dependent theological ethics as developed by Dietrich Bonhoeffer in his later work, over against classical deontologism, utilitarianism, and virtue ethics. One can think of social trinitarianism by Jürgen Moltmann, for instance, and Miroslav Volf, already mentioned by Gijsbert earlier today, liberation theology, Padilla, dialectical theology, Karl Barth, postmodern theology, Caputo, comparative theology, feminist theology, Sarah Coakley, for instance, theologies of retrieval, revisionist theology, and so on. There are just a couple of examples of theologies or approaches developed in the 20th century and 21st century that were new. So they were added to the existing views. And just because these views differ, the chances of some people believing the truth, some theologians believing the truth about it, actually increased. Right, so these were not just any random views put out there, but they were thought to be true based on certain intuitions and reasoning, attempts to be relatively coherent, and so on. And one could even go further and try to apply the kind of standard analysis of knowledge to all of this. So you could say, well, imagine that God exists. How would this play out? And of course, Reformed epistemology is developed by Alvin Plantinga and Nicholas Wolterstorff and others have argued that if indeed God exists, it may well be the case that would of course be true that God exists, people would believe that he exists, there would be a certain kind of justification, for instance by way of a sensus divinitatis, and an anti-luck condition is easily met. Well, if this holds for basic beliefs of various kinds, like that God exists or that God is good, then it may very well hold for theological views that are based on such more basic views about God, or the nature of God, or the nature of revelation, and so on. Right? And of course, one would need more than that. One would also need certain kinds of reasoning. But reasoning is something we use more often, hopefully. So as such, there's no reason to think that these views could not just be instances of true belief, but also instances of knowledge. Not only that, we also find an increasing rejection of certain falsehoods in the course of history. Certain things are just ruled out by theology as obviously false. And as we saw, not believing falsehoods is another core epistemic aim. What do I have in mind? Well, Gijsbert already mentioned the fact that very few people nowadays believe in the Greek or old Scandinavian gods. You could also think of the Ham theory, for instance, popular in the decades leading up to the Second World War. And that theory says that the black race has been cursed due to what Ham did to his father, right, as described in Genesis. No theologian, or pretty much no theologian, would defend that nowadays. It is a view, rather popular back in the day, widely rejected nowadays. Or take the view that evil logically, not just probabilistically, but logically rules out the existence of God. That view is widely rejected nowadays in the philosophy of religion and in analytic theology. Or take the somewhat Kantian view that the imago Dei consists of us being rational beings. Right, that's the core of the imago Dei. That is widely rejected nowadays, with a few exceptions. Right? So there is progress in the sense that certain falsehoods are rejected in the course of time. But there's more. There are plenty of new tools, fruitful tools in theology that were developed in the course of time. Here are a couple of examples, pretty random ones. In missiology, contextualization, church growth theory, post-colonial and intercultural hermeneutics. In exegesis, redaction, criticism, rhetorical criticism, historical criticism, canonical criticism, structural analysis, and of course, a wide variety of digital tools nowadays. In practical theology, ecclesial ethnography, and even in systematic theology, not sure what the even amounts to there, but we've got modal logic, deontic logic, and various other kinds of tools. Similarly for philosophical theology, right? So that's another way that theology has clearly made progress. Again, there's more. There is, on certain issues, convergence towards the truth, and some of those have already shown up earlier today. Virtually all Christian systematic theologians nowadays believe that the role of Israel in soteriology has been overlooked. It plays a pivotal role in understanding God's plan of reconciliation with the world. In apologetics nowadays, it's pretty much widely agreed that most of the arguments for God's existence are not meant to prove that God exists. These are inductive and many of them abductive arguments, so they're inferences to the best explanation. They raise the likelihood, epistemically, of God's existence. They're not meant as proofs, right? So there's consensus, growing consensus on these issues. Again, there's more. There's new questions that are being asked. For instance, the so-called theology of Auschwitz. So how can one believe in God in the face of genocide? Today it's January 27th, so today we commemorate the liberation of Auschwitz and the horrendous, we think of the horrendous evils of the Second World War. Liberation theology has questioned the omnipotence of God and asked whether God knows sorrow and whether God can suffer. New questions, or like at least partly new questions, right? They've become more urgent. Especially this is true for evolutionary theory, which was of course not around before the 19th century. It has raised questions about the providence of God, for instance, or God's creation, God's guiding human lives. It has raised questions about the imago Dei, As said, Gijsbert has written extensively on this. Similarly for cosmology, does the universe, and especially its size, its scale, does it count against the idea that humans have a special place, that the universe has been created by God, and so on, right? So these are all new questions, or largely new questions. Again, there's more. There's an increasing wider variety of conceptual distinctions, and many of those distinctions just seem accurate, and many of them are fruitful. Fides qua and fides que, creatio ex nihilo, creatio continua, deism, theism, monotheism, polytheism, atheism, agnosticism, apatheism. In Christian doctrine, divine accommodation, adoptionism, amillennialism, annihilationism, apophaticism, Arminianism, you could just go on. And the fun thing is that the list increases. It becomes larger every year, right? And many of those conceptual distinctions are just helpful. They testify to insight. Final point, and then I'll be done with it because one should end somewhere, but there's so much to be told. What has already been pointed out, there's an increasing interdisciplinarity in theology, and it works two ways. So theology is influenced and inspired by various other academic disciplines, and the other way around. So eco-theology, of course, the study of religion and trauma, the relation between Christianity and evolutionary theory, sometimes just mostly about compatibility, but in other cases it's even closer, like in the work of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. The doctrine of creation and the work in cosmology on fine-tuning, for instance, and Big Bang cosmology, theological anthropology, cultural anthropology, biblical exegesis and work in the Semitical languages. The list is endless. It goes on. And this is a development over time. It increases. All right, so let me leave it at that for the epistemic goals. And let's move on to the moral and prudential goals. And let's start with the confines, the boundaries. So as I said, moral goals can set certain boundaries. And if those boundaries are rightly set, that can be an instance of progress. All right, here are two examples. I think increasingly we see a certain sensitivity towards Western centrisms and sensitivity for views that might have been influenced by white colonial past. Another example is sensitivity towards other kinds of biases, such as male biases, heterosexual biases, for instance, when it comes to the doctrine of God. But also with regard to way smaller things. So, for instance, in the exegesis of the story of the two disciples on their way to Emmaus, encountering Jesus on their road. So it was an eye-opener to realize that those two disciples might well be a man and a woman, right? A couple, could very well be. But for a long time, it was kind of assumed that those were two disciples, hence two men. Why was that? I think there are certain biases that can plague us here, and I think we're becoming increasingly sensitive to that. Also, when it comes to agenda setting, there is a lot of attention nowadays for the role of women, for instance, in the Bible or in Christianity generally, and also how that influences, for instance, the doctrine of God. So T.C.S. Scruton has done tremendous work on that, or how that influences views on church leadership or ordination. We can think of minorities and race, nature, eco-theology, politics, liberation theology. Again, the list is long, and as long as one believes that there are certain moral truths out there, it seems possible for theology to make progress, both when it comes to the confines and when it comes to the agenda. All right, religious or spiritual progress then in theology, what would that look like? Well, first way in which I think theology can make progress spiritually is that it can serve the church and society. Right, that is one way. And many theologians like Karl Barth do indeed take it that that is one of the core aims, or maybe the core aim of theology. Theology can also be humble or less humble. We can increasingly become aware of the limitations of the way we think, for instance, by realizing the so-called cognitive or noetic consequences of sin and those of grace. And also certain limitations to our speech, so what can properly be said and what can no longer be properly said. Theology that is faithful to the gospel, that's another way in which there can be progress. And here one can think, for instance, also in the order in which things are said. So, and theologians might be slightly more sensitive towards this than philosophers, for instance, are. So a philosopher might tend to think, well, take a conjunction, P and Q, that has the same truth value as Q and P. Doesn't really matter in the order of the conjuncts, or the disjuncts for a disjunction. But a theologian will usually stress that the order of things does matter. So it does matter, for instance, whether we start a systematic theology with a chapter on predestination or with a chapter on the Trinity. That makes a big difference, even if we're going to say all the other things anyway. The glorification of God. To what extent do our views justice to the goodness and greatness of God? The otherness of God and other doctrines. So here you might think of the fallenness of human beings, the imago Dei, the renewal of the world, the goodness of God's creation. So, for instance, the goodness of our bodily existence and sexuality. I think few would deny that there's been great progress in theology with regard to such topics in the course of time. And there are other ones that are slightly more controversial maybe. So I encounter a lot of theologians, and I might be one of them myself, stressing that there are certain paradoxes or tensions within the Bible or within the gospel or within Christian doctrine that we should maintain. So not try to smooth out everything. For instance, the fact that God is perfectly good and yet wants his son, Jesus Christ, to die on a cross, right? You might think that there are certain paradoxes that we should maintain and not try to seek to dissolve. All right. A few final comments before I come to a few conclusions. Something about measuring progress in theology. All right. Before I say that, though, let me point out that you might not feel entirely comfortable with me talking about progress and measuring progress in particular in theology. I myself, I don't feel entirely comfortable about it. We are theologians, we're not empirical scholars, and the very idea of progress might meet some kind of resistance. And yet, if I'm right in what I argued so far, the epistemic goals are crucial to progress in theology, so seeking truth and seeking knowledge. So if measuring progress is possible, why not do it? Well, let's just think about whether progress could indeed be, or measuring progress could indeed be possible in theology. Well, how would that work? Well, I think we can identify the dimensions, goals, and skills. We can say, well, let's try to measure a particular kind of progress. So let's decide whether we're focusing on epistemic progress or moral progress, prudential progress or religious progress. Let's identify the goals. Are we talking about knowledge or rational belief or doing justice to minorities? And let's identify the skill. What would count as high up on the scale and what would count as further down the scale? Right? You can just define it, stipulate it. And then you can operationalize it. All right, so you can say, well, a good instantiation of the moral goal of doing justice to minorities would be such and such, right? And then I would say, don't think, but just count, right? As a variation to Wittgenstein's famous dictum. Or since I don't like him saying don't think, let me just slightly change that into, it doesn't work. All right. Let me change that into, wow, there's a problem with, I don't know why it drops. All right, let me just say what I wanted to say. Not only think, but also count, right? So think carefully, but also start to count once you have operationalized this. All right, so for instance, you could just start to count the things that are now widely rejected as falsehoods. One might have slight worries about this. For instance, doesn't this come with a certain risk of certain policy measures, for instance, right? So imagine that you stipulate what would count as progress and then you fail to meet certain goals of progress, right? Don't you run the risk of being shut down as a theology department as a consequence of this, for instance? Well, I thought about this, but in all honesty, I think the fact of the matter is that lots of theology programs and departments have already been shut down. And I think one of the reasons for that was that the idea was that there was no progress in theology. right? So it might have the opposite effect. It might actually lend support to the idea that indeed there is progress in theology, and that is one among various reasons to keep the theology department in at the university, so to say. All right, time then to move to the final slide, the main lessons that can be learned about, I think, progress in theology. Let me mention 4 of them. First, I think it follows from what I've argued that in assessing whether there is progress in theology, one should not merely consider epistemic progress, but also moral or prudential progress and religious progress, no matter how controversial the latter might be. For some, it is obviously among the goals of theology for others. Second, I think we need to diversify epistemic progress. There's been an obsession with convergence towards consensus. But if what I've argued is right, then there are many more ways in which there can be epistemic progress in theology. Don't reject measuring progress straight away. I think often progress in theology can be measured, and it won't hurt to do so. And the final lesson I take it is that we should be modest but also bold about progress in theology. And that has to do with the epistemic goals and the religious goals that I've mentioned earlier on. So it would follow from the virtue and goal of humility that we ought to be modest, but it follows also from the goal of truth and knowledge, and that we should be bold about progress in theology simply because it is true that there is progress in theology. Thank you so much for your attention.
Many thanks for this wonderful talk. There is room for questions, Q&A. We are doing well on the time, so we have a break at 3:30, which is half an hour away from where we are now. So please indicate through the chat whether you are whether you want to ask a question, or otherwise put your question in the chat, or if you're present here, raise your hand. Here, Luca Settimo indicated that there is a question, so please.
Yes. Thank you. Do you hear me?
I do, yeah.
We do, yeah.
So thank you for the presentation, which I enjoyed. You briefly mentioned about the issue of slavery, how things have changed. And this prompted me to think about doctrine and possibility of